Singapore today is one of the wealthiest and most stable places in the world. The average income there is even higher than that of the average American. But if you rewind the clock to 1965, almost no one believed this island could even survive, let alone prosper. Singapore had just been pushed out of Malaysia, becoming an independent nation against its will. No natural resources, no real army to speak of, widespread unemployment, suspicious neighbors on all sides. Its total land area was smaller than New York City. In a situation where everything seemed to be collapsing at once, the question was no longer, how do we grow? But can we survive at all? And here is the paradox. To survive, they could not afford to solve problems one by one. They were forced to deal with everything at the same time. But Singapore's tragedy did not begin in 1965. For centuries before that, it was little more than a small fishing village, barely a footnote on the world map. No gold, no rare spices. No empire fighting to control it. That changed in 1819, when a British official named Stamford Raffles set foot on this swampy island. People warned him about malaria, mosquitoes, pirates, and the sheer emptiness of the place. Yet those very dangers helped Raffles see what others had missed. Singapore sat precisely at the crossroads of the most important sea route on Earth, where ships traveling between Europe, India, and China all had to pass. Controlling this spot was like holding the choke point of global trade. From a rough makeshift port, Singapore quickly became a bustling trading hub. Under British rule, Chinese, Indian, and Malay workers poured in looking for jobs. The population exploded, and the city expanded. Singapore became the jewel of the British Empire in Asia, even though most of the profits still flowed back to London. Then World War II exposed a brutal truth. The British believed Singapore was an impregnable fortress. Massive coastal guns pointed out to sea convinced them no enemy could ever take the island. But they made a fatal mistake. They looked in the wrong direction. The Japanese did not attack from the sea. They came down from the north, moving through the jungles of Malaya, a route the British believed was impossible to cross. Within days, the entire defense system collapsed. In February 1942, Singapore fell. Winston Churchill called it the greatest military disaster in British history. That moment did not just mark the fall of a colony. It shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia, and from those ruins, Singapore's fate began to turn onto a completely different path. After Singapore fell, what came next carved a scar into the nation's collective memory that never truly healed. The Japanese occupation was not just a change of rulers, it was a prolonged nightmare. Tens of thousands were killed. Food was tightly controlled. Fear seeped into every alley and every home. The Japanese renamed Singapore Sayanantu, meaning Light of the South. But for the people who lived through it, this was the darkest chapter in their history. Daily life was suffocated. Human dignity was crushed. And the illusion of British protection collapsed completely. When the war ended in 1945 and the British returned, they were no longer respected masters. Singaporeans had seen with their own eyes an empire once thought unbeatable fall in less than a week. From that moment on, the desire to control their own destiny could no longer be extinguished. But the road to independence was anything but straight. Singapore was too small, too fragile, and too different from the rest of the Malayan Peninsula. The British, trying to withdraw in an orderly way, believed the safest solution was to merge Singapore into a larger nation. In 1963, Singapore joined Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak to form Malaysia. On paper, it looked like a perfect marriage. Singapore gained access to resources and strategic depth. Malaysia gained a powerful economic engine. Reality, however, quickly revealed deep cracks. Singapore's population was majority Chinese, while the Malaysian government pursued policies favoring ethnic Malays. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's leader, repeatedly called for racial equality, directly challenging the political logic of Kuala Lumpur. Tensions escalated into riots. Blood spilled onto the streets. After just 2 years, the marriage collapsed. In 1965, the Malaysian parliament voted to expel Singapore. On August 9th of that year, Singapore became independent, not amid cheers, but in tears. Lee Kuan Yew broke down on national television because he understood all too well that this could be a death sentence for the young nation. Given the reality at the time, that fear was completely justified. Singapore had no oil, no minerals, not even enough fresh water to meet its own needs. It had no strong military to defend itself. Unemployment was high, society was tense, and the economy depended heavily on British military bases that were about to leave. In that moment, Singapore looked like a bankrupt company kicked out of the market with no capital, no backing, and no time. Yet it was precisely then that Lee Kuan Yew recognized the one thing they still had: location. The island still sat at the intersection of the world's most important shipping routes. If Singapore could not rely on natural resources, then it had to become the resource. Not through military power, but by making itself indispensable to trade, manufacturing, and finance. The problem was time. There was no luxury of taking things step by step. Water, jobs, housing, education, national defense. Every one of them was a crisis. Solving one while neglecting another meant collapse. So Singapore chose a path many considered insane. They would tackle everything at once. While most newly independent countries at the time turned inward, protected their markets, and resisted Western capitalism, Singapore did the opposite. It opened its doors wide. It built an efficient government. It crushed corruption at the root. It enforced strict laws, kept taxes low, and sent a clear message to the world: if you want a safe place to invest in Asia, come to Singapore. This was not a reckless gamble. It was the only option left to survive. Opening up to the world was only the first step. For a nation to truly stand on its own, Singapore had to fix the most basic problems of daily life. The kind where one wrong move could bring every grand strategy crashing down. The most dangerous issue was water. Singapore did not just lack water. It depended almost entirely on supplies from Malaysia, a risk that threatened national survival. The government launched a long-term plan many people initially thought was delusional. Reservoirs were built right inside the city. Every rooftop became a surface for collecting rainwater. Massive investments were poured into desalination technology, even though the cost at the time was extremely high. The goal was not immediate self-sufficiency. It was to make sure no one could ever strangle the country by turning off the tap. At the same time came the jobs crisis. When the British military bases withdrew, tens of thousands of workers faced unemployment. Singapore chose rapid industrialization. Industrial zones sprang up. Factories were built. Foreign corporations were welcomed into a business environment with almost no friction, simple procedures, clear laws, and severe punishment for corruption. While many developing nations saw foreign companies as a threat, Singapore treated them as a lifeline. Every new factory meant jobs, skills, and capital flowing into the fragile economy. But economic growth meant little if people were still living in crowded, filthy slums. Housing became the third pillar. The government launched a public housing program on a scale never seen before. High-rise apartment blocks went up at breathtaking speed, replacing dangerous shantytowns. The real breakthrough was not construction itself, but ownership. People did not just rent. They were allowed to buy their homes using mandatory savings from the Central Provident Fund. The result was a society where most citizens owned stable housing, had savings for the future, and the state had a continuous pool of capital to reinvest. Education was the next piece of the puzzle. With no natural resources, people became the most valuable asset. Singapore built schools everywhere, standardized education quality, and chose English as the main language of instruction. This decision reduced ethnic tension and connected young Singaporeans directly to the global economy. At the same time, students still learned their mother tongues to preserve cultural identity. Education in Singapore was not just about producing top students. It was about creating a disciplined, practical workforce that could compete internationally. Finally came national defense. A small country with no strategic depth cannot survive without credible deterrence. Singapore introduced mandatory military service and built a modern, lean, and highly effective armed force. The goal was not to start wars, but to ensure that the cost of any invasion would be unbearably high. The results came quickly. From the 1970s onward, foreign investment poured in. The economy grew at double-digit rates. Singapore gradually became a major center for trade, finance, and transportation in Asia. But this success came at a price: strict laws, high social discipline, controlled media, limited political opposition. Western critics labeled Singapore authoritarian. Lee Kuan Yew did not dodge those accusations. He answered with outcomes: clean streets, low crime, stable housing, world-class education, and a society that simply worked. By the 1990s, Singapore's income per person had surpassed that of the United Kingdom, the country that once ruled it. When Lee Kuan Yew passed away in 2015 at the age of 91, the nation fell into collective mourning. His methods remain controversial. His results do not. From an island written off as hopeless, Singapore rose to become one of the most successful countries on earth in a single generation. And its story leaves behind a cold but powerful message. There was no miracle, only brutal choices carried through to the end, at moments when failure was never an option.